Volunteers and several state representatives gathered in Augusta today to deliver signed petitions for a bill that would require Mainers to show identification in order to vote.
Keenan Mills has the story.
Maine people are reasonable. They want to have confidence that we have strong elections in our state. And they understand that requiring an ID to vote is not radical. It's not extreme, it's common sense. And yet, the legislature has refused to act.
According to those at the gathering, 170,000 signatures from all 16 counties, more than double the required amount, were submitted with hopes of getting the citizen-led bill onto the ballot.
I don't think people need a why. It's a no-brainer. You know, it's common sense. A lot of people, and the people behind me can attest, they were at the polls collecting. A lot of them will even walk up with their ID in hand. So they don't even think about it.
According to Secretary of State Shenna Bellows, 2024's presidential election set voter turnout records the state has never before seen. Some argue a voter ID law, which currently exists in 36 other states, would discourage people from voting.
What we have seen in other states is that requiring certain types of voter ID at the polling places on Election Day does result in some legitimate voters being turned away and does increase wait times at the polls.
The initiative includes new laws and proposals outside of voter ID, including mandates surrounding absentee ballots.
My concern is that by rolling back the absentee voting request timeline and making it harder to vote absentee, as well as introducing these other burdensome requirements, we may see voter participation fall in years to come, should this pass.
The minor other elements in this proposal are very minor. In regards to absentee voting, yeah, this proposal requires a proof of photo identification at the point of casting a ballot.
If the signatures are confirmed, the expectation is the measure will be on the ballot in November. Keenan Mills, WABI News, Augusta.